Welcome to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course. Welcome to the most recent episode. That doesn't make sense time-wise, does it? The most recent episode, this episode of our podcast right here, right now. Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. I am the temporarily, as in the sense of challenged by time, Kate Fox. My co-host is Nick King. We will hear from her soon. But I'm going to introduce our guests. This is one of our special guest podcasts. Sonny Hallett and Fergus Murray have been absolutely key figures for me at various points in my autistic identity journey, because both their tentacles, they are not octopuses, but both their tentacles spread across many areas of autistic and neurodivergent activism, writing, advocacy, and research as well. We're particularly going to focus on the theory of monotropism, which Fergus's late mum, Dinah, was a key proponent of, and Fergus now keeps the monotropism.org website going. But we could also talk and branch off into their work on the Amaze Collective. And I was lucky enough to... Oh, hang on, this is going to become the world's longest introduction. I'm going to stop there. So we get gist. They're really important. And Sonny in particular is training as a counsellor, has trained as a counsellor, is working as a counsellor, has done really important research into counselling for autistic people, which I think is another episode. Let's crack on.
Let's try and be monotropic, Kate.
That's what I'm struggling with. Oh, the irony. So what is, in summary, you're going to have to choose as to who to answer, really. I'm going to go to you, Fergus, first, actually, just because of your family link. Could you tell us about the backdrop to the theory of monotropism, as well as briefly what it is? We've talked about it before on this podcast, but for first-time listeners.
So, monotropism is a theory of autism which was developed by my mum, Dinah Murray, when I was sort of in my early teens, roughly, I guess. So she started talking about it in 91, I think, and talked about it in public in 92 at the Durham conference, which at that point was sort of the main autism conference in Britain, as far as I understand it. Later, she worked with Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser, all of whom were autistic. Two of whom are now dead. Wen is still alive, which is great. So the idea of monotropism is that some people tend to focus our attention and other processing resources on a smaller number of things at a time. Another way to put that is that we have a smaller number of interests aroused at any given time, where an interest is understood as something which pulls our attention in, which I think is more or less what people mean by it in general, but it's perhaps a perspective on what it is that people wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So as a lens on a certain style of thinking, monotropism can explain most of the main features of autistic experience, and arguably all of the features of autistic experience once you pull in some other things about being a human.
And that, I mean, that's huge, really, isn't it? As in, here is a theory that can basically explain all elements of autistic experience with the additional being human bits, it is still not the dominant theory underpinning the well, certainly not underpinning the medical model, and certainly not underpinning what doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists are working with, but it is becoming increasingly popular, and it's certainly very well recognised now within the autistic community. Sonny, could you talk us through maybe a little bit about the more recent growth in popularity of monotropism as a theory? What are you seeing and what are you experiencing there?
Yeah, I think something that's really sort of special and important about the theory of monotropism is that it comes from autistic experience. So it is not a theory that comes from observing us from the outside and going, that's what they're like. It's something that comes from autistic people going, this is how I experience the world. And I think that's one of the reasons it can be very resonant for some people. Like it's lovely hearing so many autistic people really resonate, and people who just experience being monotropic as well, maybe without necessarily realizing that they're autistic, or maybe they're not. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about kind of autism and ADHD in that context later. But yeah, so like hearing people feel validated, right, by a theory of autism, which I think in the past, when we look at other ways of explaining autism, people don't tend to feel very validated in the sense of like, you know, it tends to be more pathologizing. It tends to be more about what we can't do or what we're doing, quote unquote, wrong. That said, I think it is sort of important to, I don't know, I kind of want to acknowledge that the framing of monotropism in a very sort of reductionist, simple way can lead some people to go, oh, I don't resonate with that. And therefore, does that mean I'm not autistic? Or does that mean this is wrong in some way? And, you know, this is a theory that's very relatively early still in its sort of stages of being, I mean, it's been going for a while, but it's, you know, in its stages of being more recognized and understood. And I think that there is a lot more nuance to sort of understanding what it means to have a narrow range of interests. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have few interests. Most autistic people I know actually are interested in loads of things. But it's more to do with how we use our attention at different times.
Do you think part of that sort of difficulty in association with being monotropic is the sort of the very high co-occurring of ADHD within our community, and realistically sometimes depending on how that's working in your brain, how accessible monotropism is to you as an autistic person, particularly if we think about our generation who is largely undiagnosed and unmedicated. Do you think that's part of why people struggle to sort of identify with it in those that do? Yeah. Fergus?
Yes. I think it's a big part of the picture, and it's really interesting because at the same time, a lot of ADHD has recognized themselves in monotropism. So before I was even really thinking about ADHD very much, I wrote Me and Monotropism, a unified theory of autism for Psychologist magazine. And I was a little bit taken aback by how many ADHDers said, hang on, aren't you just talking about ADHD? It's like, wait, because on the surface, ADHD looks like the opposite of monotropism, right? It sounds like it because it's full of like jumping from interest to interest, not being able to focus in a sustained way. But then actually, if you talk to ADHDers, it turns out hyperfocus is an extremely common experience for ADHD people. But it's not all the time, and yeah, a lot of the time, ADHD experience is characterized by hopping from thing to thing to thing because they're not accessing that kind of deep monotropic flow state. And yeah, for me, I'm currently pursuing a diagnosis of ADHD. I'm somewhat uncertain about whether to call myself ADHD. And for me, I used to think that I was not monotropic enough to count as autistic because I did this thing of hopping from thing to thing to thing. And I liked to think that that meant that I was kind of polytropic. But then eventually I realized that no, I'm actually just a serial monotropist. I focus intensely on one thing and then I shift my attention to another thing and I totally forget about what I was focusing on just now. I used to think that I was multitasking. No, I was not multitasking. So yeah, it's definitely part of the picture of why not everybody resonates with it, but I think that's kind of a mistake. And I think there's a lot to dig into in how differently monotropism manifests for different people.
We really, I don't know which we I'm speaking for, but the phrase serial monotropist feels very, very important. Because it's like serial monogamist, isn't it? There's almost like, oh, it's nearly a bad thing to be, but kind of not if you remember. There's almost a just anyway, but I just want, I'm aware because there are so many directions we could shoot off in with both of you. I'm just thinking of our listener. I always refer to the listener in the singular because I'm an old radio person who pretend just one person is listening. Hello, listener. We're talking to you. And we're aware that some of you are going, yeah, but what is it really concretely? So I just wondered if we could each, starting with you, Sonny and Fergus, but me and Nick will do it as well, could we each talk a little bit about how we think our monotropism. You can note how quickly I've picked up. I was saying monotropism. I've decided to join in and say monotropism for the length of the rest of this podcast. How does that manifest, in your life? What's your monotropic being like, and what do you focus on? Sonny, go on. How is it for you?
Yeah, I like that question. I think for me, I've always had a tendency to dive into things really deeply, and I find it very hard to let things go. So it can be interests, it'll be like if I go through a period of I don't know, building things out of Lego, then everything in the world looks like Lego. And I'm like, oh, how can I build that out of Lego? Looking at, I don't know, like a teapot or something, or a telegraph pole. So everything in the world gets filtered through whatever interest is most present in that moment. And sometimes it can be to the point of like being like, I really want to think about something else now, but I can't. In my life now, I find that can be really helpful. Like I think that I go into a very monotropic focus mode when I work as a counselor, and that means that I can be very, very intensely there in the moment in the people I'm working with, and it's like I love it because it's like the whole world melts away, and I'm just in that moment with the other person and whatever's going on for them and their frame of reference, and it's like being able to access a flow state as part of my work without it being consuming in a way that means that like I've been sitting at a desk for 6 hours, which I used to do illustration, and that would be the case, and I hadn't peed or eaten or anything. So that's kind of monotropism to me, experienced as a sort of really kind of like positive thing, I guess. I think the other way that I experience it is in sort of like I can ruminate on things. I get into sort of what I call loops of concern, where I might have a worry, and I mean that's me for the next 8 hours. Like I guess I'll just think about this worry forever now, and I think that's quite common for a lot of autistic people as well. So yeah, I think that those are the sort of things that jump out at me when I think about being monotropically focused.
Thank you. Brilliant.
If there's a topic you would like us to explore, let us know. You can do that via our website, Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. You will also find a PayPal link there where you could leave us a little financial tip, and your support really helps keep us going.
Fergus?
Yeah, so a lot of it is about intense interests, and at any given time, I do tend to have an intense interest in a relatively small number of things. I cycle between interests quite a lot, and yeah, I think this is one of these things which sometimes people read descriptions of monotropism and they don't resonate with them because they're like me and they might have intense interests for a while, but not necessarily for a very long time. Although, having said that, there are certain interests which I've had, throughout my life and which I keep on returning to. Physics is one of them, science generally. Um, I'm endlessly fascinated by waves in all their forms. That's never really gone away, and the behavior of water. So one of the ways that monotropism manifests in my life is that I am regularly distracted by moving water. I'll sort of notice rain falling in a puddle, and I'll just, zone in on that for a while. I've had a kind of a hobby of filming water in slow motion for the last few years. I've accumulated several hundred clips, sort of mostly between about half a minute and a couple of minutes, probably, because it turns out most modern phones and cameras have a slow motion mode, and it means that you can just point your camera at some water for 5 seconds and you've got like half a minute to a minute of fascinating footage, if you're into that kind of thing, which I am.
And it can make you seem really distractible, right? Because Fergus and I will be having a conversation and suddenly they've gone to film some water. And I'm just like, where did you go? You were here a minute ago.
Yeah, but I haven't really left. I'm capable of maintaining a couple of things in my mental buffer at any given time. So if we're having a conversation and I notice something else, I can usually get back to the conversation. Yeah, those are some of the ways. Lately, I've been playing Baldur's Gate 3 a lot, and I keep kind of coming back to that. That's the kind of thing that like a relatively short-term interest might have me coming back and back and back. But yeah, there's also the long-term things like how we think, the nature of reality and physics, and tea. I have a very long-standing interest in tea, which has been less intense for the last, I don't know, 10 years. I sort of got back to it a bit in the last year or two. So.
Thank you. Oh, wouldn't it? Someone must be doing this, a podcast about people's particular interests, because the idea of just hearing someone talk about moving water, like, you kind of end up wanting to hear more about that, but we're not going to, because we're going to hear Nick, you and monotropism. How is it for you?
I struggled with monotropism when I first heard about it. I can see it. I can see it in like my uncle who has a fascination with trains. I'm directly related to George Stephenson. There's possibly nothing much more autistic than inventing trains. But like, and I can see it in like my husband, who's a very specialist software engineer, and that has been his monotropism throughout his life. My granddad, it was electricity. And it's one of the reasons that I struggled with identifying being autistic, because I was very much in my head struggling to access monotropism. Now, recently, Nick's been medicated for their ADHD, and monotropism is happening, and it is happening intensely. And it's kind of awesome. And then there's this narrative that we do not have time to digress to, but like that, you become more autistic when, and you don't, dear listener, you do not become more autistic when you start taking ADHD medication. It's not a thing. But in terms of perception and how you are perceived, and if we are perceiving people who are being autistic by their focus on an interest, that's definitely happened. So yeah, now that my ADHD is medicated correctly, I am very much being perceived as, yeah, more almost sort of stereotypically autistic, because the focus is happening. And even sort of within myself, I was like, oh, it was there all along, but my brain was not chemically set up to access it, and now it very much is. So there we go.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. And briefly, me and monotropism is, I see the world through a lens at the moment of Buddhism mainly. I've always been interested in liminal things. Doctor Who, kind of, but probably not in the stereotypical way that people maybe think of Whovians, where they remember all the facts. And it's just, it pings my,
Joy.
my what?
Joy.
My joy. Oh yeah, it pings my joy. And I was going to say my, I don't know, charge, something, it's always charged. So my new show is about Doctor Who. And I feel when I'm in a room, when I'm about to do my show, I am so monotropic because there's only the show that I'm doing. That's the only thing. But apparently some other things exist in the world. What? How rude. And then people want to tell me about the things, actually, and interest me in the thing. No, not the other things. But anyway, so, okay. I want to jump actually to Fergus. Oh, how have we only got 5 minutes? How is that? How Nick's just held up her hand and gone 5 minutes? Like, we've barely scratched the surface. So in that case, I'm going to quickly ask Fergus this because we had this in mind, me and Nick. We talk a lot in this podcast about our relative neurodivergent privilege, and actually this will resonate in different ways, I think, for both you, Fergus, and you, Sonny. We kind of both feel that it's highly verbal, and for all sorts of reasons. We've kind of got quite a lot of neurodivergent privilege, and we're both, white, cis, northeasterners. There's not that privileged. Fergus, not the northeastern bit. Fergus. You're in a lineage of Dinah Murray, and I'm just we're like, does that add to your neurodivergent privilege in a strange way? Maybe on two counts. One, your mum discovered her neurodivergent identity through the course of her life and wrote and spoke about it, and two, somehow being in that field of awareness. Does that make sense? And do you experience that sort of privilege?
Yeah. So I'm taking a minute to process because there's a lot in there, right? So specifically with respect to neurodivergence, yeah, I mean, my mum, I think, figured out that she was autistic herself around about the same time that I did. Maybe she was a year or two ahead of me, although she didn't really talk to me about it at the time. Like when she started talking and writing about monotropism, she knew that she was relatively monotropic, but thought that she wasn't monotropic enough to count as autistic. Which, to be fair, they redefined autism somewhere down the line, and it's possible that she really wasn't when she's back in '92 or whatever. So yeah, there's that, and because of Dinah's work, I grew up knowing autistic people. I mean, from my teenage years onwards, people like Damien Milton and Larry Arnold would come over and stay sometimes, and Went Lawson, obviously. And I also got to meet quite a lot of significantly less neurologically privileged autistic people, because she was a support worker for 20 odd years, which he had originally got into to see if she was right about autism, basically. So yeah, I met non-speaking autistic people who require a lot of support day to day. I also volunteered to work with disabled kids a fair bit, so I've not only had experience of relatively privileged autistic people, which I think to some extent that can be a problem in the autistic community, where people feel like they can talk about autism in general when actually they don't know any non-speaking autistic people, for example. Although I think it's less of a problem than it's often portrayed to be by people who have
aren't even autistic.
Yeah, people who aren't even autistic, exactly. It's most people who aren't autistic have kids who have relatively high support needs and just don't want to believe autistic adults about our experiences. I feel like I should also talk about the fact that it's not just about neurodivergence specifically. My mum was weird. I knew that I was weird from an early age. People kept telling me. And I was fortunate to have the kind of upbringing where I kind of knew that that wasn't inherently a bad thing. So, you know, my mum was talking about weird pride from probably the mid-90s. She made herself a weird pride badge somewhere down the line, sort of scrawled on cardboard and attached with a safety pin and worn to fancy events about autism. And she, again, came from a relatively privileged background with respect to that, because she came from a family of intellectual weirdos, frankly. You know, she wrote about this quite explicitly in One That Got Away, which is her sort of little autobiographical chapter about being autistic and weird and not being quite sure yet whether to identify as autistic. People, you know, would say, look, you're clearly autistic, Dinah, and other people would say, look, Dinah, you're clearly not autistic. And, you know, she was like, yeah, I don't know. But a couple of years later, she was much more confidently identifying as such. And, you know, like so many of us, there were probably a bunch of autistic people in our lineage, right, in our family. And in some ways, that's a privilege. But in other ways, it's not, because your problems might not be treated as much as problems as they otherwise might be. I feel like I've probably talked for 5 minutes there, and we are...
No, and that's absolutely brilliant, Fergus. And it's so relevant to the theme of our podcast in so many ways, and opens up something huge. I'm aware of time, and we do tend to stick, and we will stick to the half hour. And I'm aware that Sonny's experiences, stories, feelings around neurodivergent privilege and or lack of across kind of gender lines, ethnicity, like all sorts of lines, deserve a whole podcast in themselves. We're not going to attempt for a minute to squish that into 30 seconds, because that would be the worst thing that's ever happened. No. What we're going to note is these areas are huge. I'm really glad we went from kind of monotropism back to that constant theme of, okay, so this thing that seems like it's just one thing, oh, irony, monotropism, one thing, is actually multiple things, not always recognizable in people's experiences in a simple way, in the same way that our identities as neurodivergent people are not always recognizable in a simple way as either good or bad. Serial monotropist, good thing or bad thing. You, the listener, will probably not decide, but we will carry on talking.
Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.